In the late spring of 2014, a gathering of 4 companions embraced a cavern jumping undertaking in the district of Costa Brava, Spain. Their objective was the Cov d'Elsa race. Notwithstanding its light-hearted moniker, the cavern conveys more foreboding implications. This was a spot they ought to have never entered. However, a craving to investigate the neglected influenced the gathering's perspective, so they chose to proceed their arrangement to enter it. This is their frightening story. Kel's AR case, or Cavern of Coffins, isn't especially huge by submerged cave complex principles. As a matter of fact, it's only 262 FD or ATM from one finish to another. It has a shockingly straightforward design too. Its entry is 23 FD or 7 m deep down the Cov d'Elsa case is well known with experienced jumpers, submerged picture takers, and sea life researcher who appreciate the exceptional geographical elements and the different natural life inside and around the cavern. Swimmers and free jumpers once in a while swim down to the cavern's mouth too. Yet if you feel compelled to wander inside for a few unmistakable reasons, truly Cov d'Elsa case is simply too dull. Nobody truly understands what's happening down there, and it's super startling overall. It's not open to general society for security reasons, since individuals have kicked the bucket in there that set a magnet to those needed genuine experience and to investigate the obscure. Jumpers who enter the cavern should initially swim along the floor to move toward roughly 25 FD or 7.6 m prior to beginning up to a slight rising toward an unmistakable protuberance. At the furthest finish of the mound lies a stone throw entrance, prompting another enormous dim chamber. Guides of the cavern really do exist, yet there's no record of anybody truly swimming into that second chamber. Obviously, its size, aspects, and geology are generally obscure, and throughout the long term, it's turned into somewhat of a metropolitan legend. On the morning of Saturday, July 19, 2014, the sun empowered the 4 companions as they at last left on the experience that they had been contemplating for some time. They got together through a buckling bunch, yet not a solitary one of them at any point went into any serious caverns, particularly ones that were not investigated and considered destructive. They were truly eager to take a stab at something new and stretch their boundaries. Their energy consistently expanded as they took a boat over to the cavern. Everybody was feeling great. This experience was at last happening. It took them long stretches of intending to at long last move all settled up, so this was no joking matter for themselves, and an undertaking that they were expecting to have the option to fill their companions in. About when the excursion was over, they've all plunged along the shore of Bravo region before yet something that truly acquired them to this cavern, specific from the wide range of various neglected collapses. The world was that this one takes into account new disclosures to be made. There's researchers that really need to understand what's inside, and they'll work with the jumpers to sort out their best arrangement of procedure for getting in the game and getting out securely. The companions realize that KC plunging was intrinsically unsafe, yet it was the sprinkle of risk that worked everything out, such that charming and habit-forming, they just couldn't get enough of it. Was similar to adrenaline junkies that like to go skydiving or go wingsuit flying. When they showed up close to the Cadell's specialty case, Ricard and Denisio, 2 truly old buddies and buddies. They had known one another for a significant length of time, and a third unidentified companion outfitted shared restless looks and slipped into the reasonable blue water they needed to investigate, and it was occurring in the meantime. The 4th companion remained on the boat, and he was the one that, assuming anything turned out badly, he planned to find help to get his companions out. Assuming that there was a setback or crisis, he could help them and assist with getting different jumpers nearby and ready specialists, if necessary, from the beginning. Ricard and Denisio and the other jumper got their direction and investigated a couple of the other cavern or collapses the region, after which they wound up toward the front of Cadell's array slowered entrance. They sort of sprung up before them. They could hardly imagine how they were at last here, and going to go into this cavern, even 23 down. Then the daylight entered the water so much that they really had a solid sense of reassurance. Investigating inside and around the little opening, they weren't in the cavern yet. They were going down to the entry, other than not many beams of faint light skipping around inside. The inside was a restricting chasm with no perceptible structure. They additionally saw that inside the walls were made of like a delicate dirt material, and that the floor was shrouded in fine silk. This is an extremely terrible thing for cave jumpers, since supposing that this residue stirs up, it blinds them, and they in a real sense can't see anything in such circumstances. Jumpers frequently utilize a rule outside the cavern prior to entering. This is, for the most part, a typical practice, yet particularly evident when there's sediment on the floor of the cavern. Then, if they lose perceivability or become muddled while inside, they can just follow the rope out anyway. Ricard and Denisio and the third jumper didn't have the rope. Somebody failed to remember it when they were getting together and preparing. This was a serious mix-up, yet they sort of ignored it and progressed forward, confronted with two decisions. The third man understood that he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and told Ricard and Denisio that he was leaving. He could have done without the way that they failed to remember the rope. He likewise thought it was an ill-conceived notion to go into the cavern with the mud-like walls and the sediment on the lower part of the cavern floor. Everything was advising him to leave, and he attempted to persuade Ricard and Denisio that this would be a very risky jump to proceed, and that they ought to not go. As experienced jumpers and long-term companions, they regarded his choice to leave. However, they wouldn't pay attention to what he was talking about. They had full trust in the thing they were doing, and they considered the plunge rope not no joking matter, since they'd been in and out of caverns before without utilizing one, and nothing terrible occurred, and so they let their companions know that it would have been okay, and they'll be fine on their own. After all, they realize that paying attention to your gut feelings was no indication of shortcoming. What's more, Denisio investigated each other, offered a go-ahead, and afterward continued to swim inside. They hadn't come on this experience just to betray the last moment. With that, they swam significantly further into the cavern, supported by their spotlights and consoled by the noticeable entrance behind them. They covered the initial 115 feet, or 35 m, effortlessly. It was lovely inside, and things were wonderful. The sediment wasn't coming up the dirt-like walls, weren't creating any issues, and they may as yet see some of the daylight looking down into the cavern. However, with each foot they acquired their hearts thump all the more quickly, with the obscurity turning out to be increasingly more outright. It was only scary inside, and they continued to think to and fro at one another, similar to, are we going to continue onward or simply abandon this entire excursion altogether? However, they just continued to go. Then, when they went to in excess of 260 feet, or 61 m, into the cavern, they all the while reached similar resolution. They enticed blur enough for one day, and they truly needed to get out of there. They knew that assuming anything turned out badly, regardless of whether the littlest measure of sill came up into their way, there would be an extremely remote possibility that they could get out now. It was the ideal opportunity for them to go to the surface anyway. They had been so expectation on what was in front of them that they neglected to understand that their balances had unsettled a thick layer of residue on the cavern floor, and presently as they went to go, they could scarcely make out their hands only a couple of feet before their countenances. They attempted to get one another, yet there was nothing there more awful. Yet the abrupt change in water clearness had made them lose their ability to know east from west, and with no rope or apparent markers to direct them, they had absolutely not a chance of knowing where they came in. They could have recently headed down any path, and it presumably would have recently driven them further down into the cavern, which is where they would run out of air and kick the bucket. Then it hit Denisio. He could swim around for quite a long time and never tracked down the entries subsequent to looking around. For quite a while there, air in their tanks began to get hazardously low. The two of them knew that sitting tight for the sill to settle was an impossible choice. It could take perhaps hours, yet in some cases days or weeks. They'd essentially be holding up to their demises, and unquestionably they'd run out of air before the water cleared. It would be simple for them to stand by, yet it's anything but a choice then. When it seemed like everything trust was lost, a thin beam of light pierced into the dimness above them, and Denisio thought, in this climate, it must be daylight driven by distress and the will to live. They swam towards it. As they moved toward the lake, up increasingly bright and surprisingly more encouraging, the break was a lot bigger than they initially had naturally suspected. As a matter of fact, it was somewhat more extensive than their bodies. This was a supernatural occurrence that won't ever occur. At the point when you cave plunge, they swam up and into the break, trusting that by some fortunate turn of events, it would broaden and at last lead them to the surface anyway. The further they went, the smaller this break turned out to be in the long run. They thought their advancement would be ended altogether as the wall started squeezing them firmly against their backs, chests, and arms. In the meantime, they began to feel like they were never going to escape this break and pass on. Trapped in it looked progressively probable, like they had stalled out or come to a dead end, and they would run out of air and die in some horrible, nightmarish way, heaving in the murkiness. Marvelously, the section stayed sufficiently wide for them to just barely get through. They continued winding their direction through, distorting their body as they went endlessly further into the break. Some way or another, they did ultimately get through, yet when they did, they were in a completely unique piece of the cavern that they were not expecting. At first, they didn't know what was happening. However, at that point, they understood. They broke into another cavern that was running lined up with the Kel's Arasi cave. Their heads, shoulders, and arms were 11 and 1/2T air pocket, caught at the highest point of a lowered sinkhole. Quickly perceiving their favorable luck, they eliminated their hardware and took in the air. Denisio gave a sickening focus on Ricard, in light of the fact that he realized that there could be carbon dioxide in the air, and it could simply kill them however they lucked out, and there was a sufficient blend of air that they had the option to inhale regularly with their lungs loaded up with air. An immense adrenaline rush came over them. Ricard and Denisio felt like they had recently beaten the grave at the 9th hour. They even took photos inside this little air pocket, since they were so blissful and needed to recollect it for when they got out. Now they contemplated internally all. Or on the other hand, gas were at that point on the job, watching out for the swimmers and jumpers in the space. This was simply one more godsend for them. Group pioneer Corporal Fernando Aguirre promptly started sorting out a salvage party that he trusted would have the option to get in the water by late evening or afternoon, since he realized the salvage would be testing and possibly hazardous. He likewise enacted the common gatekeeper's public plunging bunch. Furthermore, he enrolled help from sea life scientists, submerged picture takers, private plunge habitats, and lobster anglers to figure out what they knew about the Cove de Lorettes, in light of the fact that there's simply not much of data on it, and he didn't know anything about it specifically. Tragically, they couldn't give him significantly more data than he previously had, which was essentially nothing. One scientist gave a crude guide, however it didn't go that far, and it finished in the pungent sinkhole where Ricard and Denisio had disappeared. Corporal Gary and his group were generally sure that Ricard and Denisio were someplace inside the cavern, yet they knew from first-hand experience that most snare jumpers don't live extremely lengthy. He was trusting they were in an air pocket. However, on the off chance that that wasn't true, there was no possibility of safeguarding them, so they were almost certain that they would have been doing a body recuperation in the meantime, actually caught in that air pocket. Ricard and Denisio didn't know how long the air sinkhole would wait or when the salvage activity would start off. There was a restricted measure of air that they could inhale, and after that, they would gradually begin gagging, feeling their lungs exceptionally weighty, and afterward, at last choke in a brutal spot of destiny. The demonstration of them breathing was gradually killing them as they breathed in and breathed out. The air in the sinkhole was being supplanted via carbon dioxide, and this harmful result was harming their generally focused on bodies. To exacerbate the situation, they were experiencing difficulty clutching the sinkhole's smooth walls. This implied that they needed to float on the grounds, that the base was 24 feet down, and there weren't any edges to sit or remain on. This consistent effort expanded their pulses in breathing, which thusly accelerated the physical and mental impacts of the carbon dioxide harming they were starting to encounter as the experience delayed for what probably appeared as though an unending length of time. The young fellows additionally started experiencing parchedness, hypothermia, and out-and-out despair. Ricard was in more regrettable shape than Denisio, yet, with their circumstance turning out to be more desperate constantly, the two of them to a great extent surrender to their bleak destinies. They would have rather not talked, they would have rather not taken a gander at one another. Jay just needed to be quiet in that cave. In the end, Ricard could scarcely keep his head above water, and on at least one event he discreetly slipped underneath the surface, and each time Denisio gathered all the energy in his depleted body and would pull his companion back up. Anyway, as the hours delayed, the psychological and actual burdens turned out to be a lot to handle, and when Ricard slipped underneath the surface, that last time his companion wasn't able to act the hero. Ricard unfortunately recently continued sinking presently, alone shaking in the virus water, and uncertain if a salvage had been sent off. Denisio arrived at the understanding that, like his companion, it was inevitable before he kicked the bucket in the cavern of coffins, yet some way or another he had the option to track down it in himself, to stick onto the cloudy vision of a future where he was once again encompassed by companions, friends, and family. An outside air, yet unbeknownst to him, Corporal Airy and a group of expert salvage jumpers had been in the water searching for him since 50 p.m. Not long from now into their inquiry, they were faced with an almost impervious mass of sediment. Ricard and Denisio had worked up that morning. This was verification that they were doing great. However, in any event, for experts like Corporal Agiri and his group, the kick the bucket was full of risks. This salvage activity was very hazardous, and the heroes could have effectively kicked the bucket during their hunt. They gained great headway from the get-go, yet in the silty water, they had not a chance of knowing what direction the men had headed, where they had wound up, or on the other hand, in the event that they were as yet alive. This was one more savage incongruity. The silty water was proof that Ricard and Denisio had passed that way, and yet it clouded them from the very men who they had come to save. It resembled a wall that they were simply not going to have the option to overcome. As night fell, the salvage jumpers returned to the surface. For Denisio, it was an evening of sheer dread, weariness, and hopelessness anyway. The pursuit continued early that following morning, and by then many writers were on the scene to get data on the creating story. Experienced jumpers and search and salvage staff from everywhere the country had shown up to assist, yet most knew that the probability of finding Ricard and Denisio was right around zero. Fortunately, the SA had at last settled when the jumpers showed up at the Kelsa race entrance that morning. However, prior to entering, they secured a plunge line outside the cavern. They won't misstep the same way that Denisio and Rad made then. As they swam into moderately clear water, they saw the very faint light emission light that Ricard and Denisio had seen the day preceding. Imagining the missing men's perspective, they expected that swimming toward the light would have been their main choice. The principal hero to enter the break found it excessively limited and attempted to turn around. He was worried that he planned to stall out and not have the option to get out, and afterward, he understood He was unable to get out, assuming he attempted to return, so he pushed through with all that he endlessly needed to reshape his body, and afterward went on vertical. Lastly entered that chamber that Ricard and Denisio had been in, clearing them. Inside, with his strong spotlight, he quickly saw Ricard's dormant body drifting in his neoprene wetsuit. He expected that he'd track down Denisio's body straight away. However, shockingly, he was gripping unstably to a rough stone on the most distant side of the cave when he understood that he was at this point not the only one. He let out a struggled groan that alarmed Corpo Giri, and the other salvage jumper, Denisio, had fairly figured out how to remain alive under the inconceivable circumstances. However, he was so depleted, dried out, hypothermic and perplexed that his endurance was a long way from specific. The way that he was as yet alive was extraordinary. It was what they expected, yet freeing him from the cavern would be one more monstrous test, and getting him out alive wasn't doing great. And even with salvation so close, Denisio would not put on the air tank that they had brought to him. He was simply dazed and had no clue about what was happening. He was battling the salvage jumpers and believed that they were attempting to hurt him. He had no clue about that they were there to help him. Corpo Giri understood that Denisio failed to see where he was, the means by which he arrived, or who the heroes were. Sue basically wouldn't coordinate, expecting that he'd just answer somebody. He knew Corporal Airy quickly got back to the surface and persuaded Denisio's plunging companion, who came with him, to go with him back into the cavern to save Denisio. He wasn't certain about it yet. He concluded he needed to do it. He knew how perilous this salvage mission would be for him, yet it was the main thing that should be possible to save Denisio, so he followed Corporal Aguirre into the cave with some other salvage jumpers and worked his direction down to where that air-old cave was at long last seeing a cordial and natural face. Advanced the circumstance, however, by that midday, Corporal Airy chose to calm Denisio in light of the fact that there was no time left, and he knew it was the main way they built to get him out alive. Then, something like 24 hours after he had gone into the cavern, Denisio at long last broke the surface, joined by Corporal Airy, the group of salvage jumpers, and his companion. Now that Denisio was free from any potential harm, they need to return in tow. Recuperate Ricard's body. Denisio was the principal D in Spain to endure such a mishap, and when the media craze subsided, Corporal Leary sent off an exhaustive examination to decide why the jump finished in misfortune. It was amazing that Ricard passed on from carbon dioxide harming, which is otherwise called hypercapnia anyway. Corporal Gur's last report noticed that none of the jumpers had the important preparation or experience to embrace such a difficult make-a plunge expansion. They overlooked or were new to essential well-being safeguards, like introducing a plunge line that would have directed them to somewhere safe through the residue-ridden water. Some even called out Denisio for not saving Ricard from suffocating anyway. Corporal Gary's report noticed that he currently saved his companion on various occasions, yet that in the end, he simply needed more solidarity to keep him from suffocating. Denisio eventually caused a momentous recuperation, and that is all there is to it for now. And I to see the value in you watching until the end. In the event that you found this story both captivating and deplorable, kindly make certain to show an affection to the like button and buy into our feed for additional accounts like this one. Desire to see you at the following one.